Arben, Luan, and Dritan started as desperate young men from small Albanian villages, but within a decade, they had built one of Europe's most secretive and powerful criminal empires, quietly controlling the continent's dark economy without leaving a trace. In the early 1990s, Albania was a nation in ruins. Decades of isolation under a harsh communist regime had left the country with crumbling infrastructure, empty factories, and a population struggling to survive. People had grown used to hunger, fear, and uncertainty, but the sudden collapse of the government unleashed chaos unlike anything they had experienced before. Borders that had once been tightly controlled were now porous, and weapons from abandoned military stockpiles flooded into the streets. Ordinary citizens, many with no experience in crime, found themselves armed and desperate, searching for ways to protect their families and secure some form of income in a collapsing economy. In this environment, a new generation of young men began to form groups, initially for survival, but these gatherings would slowly evolve into something far more dangerous. The streets of Albanian cities became a training ground for resourcefulness and ruthlessness. Small towns, previously quiet and isolated, now harbored pockets of tension, where survival often meant taking whatever opportunities came along. Smuggling basic goods across borders became a daily routine, and with it, lessons in secrecy, logistics, and negotiation. Those who were particularly ambitious began to realize that their skills could travel beyond Albania's borders. As Europe opened up to new waves of immigrants, these young men moved abroad, carrying with them the habits, networks, and knowledge they had gained at home. To outsiders, they appeared as ordinary immigrants seeking work. But behind this facade, seeds of organized crime were quietly being planted. Many of these individuals settled first in Italy and Greece, drawn by proximity and familiarity, and then gradually moved to major European cities like Milan, London, and Brussels. At first, their lives were humble. They took low-paying jobs in construction, cleaning, or food delivery, often living in crowded apartments with others from their hometowns. They sent money back home whenever possible, building small pockets of stability for their families, while silently observing the societies around them. They noticed how law enforcement operated, how local gangs conducted business, and how money could be moved and hidden. This observation was crucial. Unlike traditional criminals, who often relied on brute force, these newcomers learned the importance of strategy, patience, and discretion. Within these immigrant communities, a strong sense of loyalty began to develop. People from the same villages or families stuck together, sharing resources and information. Trust became the currency of survival. Those who betrayed the group found themselves ostracized, and in some cases, disappearing entirely. This loyalty would later become a defining feature of the criminal organizations that emerged. As years passed, the young men who had arrived in Europe as survivors transformed into operators who understood the hidden rules of urban crime and the weaknesses of law enforcement. The foundation was laid for a network that could eventually stretch across borders, moving unseen and unchallenged, growing quietly while the rest of Europe remained unaware. By the end of the decade, what had started as desperate acts of survival had evolved into a disciplined, patient, and secretive group ready to exploit opportunities in Europe's underground economy. These were not reckless criminals. They were students of the shadows, learning to move without attracting attention, preparing to seize power in a continent unprepared for the silent storm that was coming. The quiet beginnings in Albania, born out of desperation and necessity, would soon ignite a chain of events that reshaped the dark underworld of Europe forever. As Albanian immigrants settled into European cities, they realized that survival alone would not secure their future. Observing the criminal landscape around them became a matter of necessity. Unlike other gangs, which relied heavily on visible intimidation and public displays of power, the Albanians studied from the shadows. They watched established networks, noting how drugs were transported from one country to another, how money was laundered through legitimate businesses, and how law enforcement conducted investigations. Every move of rivals and authorities was carefully observed, analyzed, and stored for future use. This period of learning was crucial. It allowed them to enter the criminal world not as reckless outsiders, but as strategic players who understood the rules before breaking them. The networks they joined initially were small and fragmented. Many were linked to local street gangs or older organized crime families that had been operating in Europe for decades. The Albanians quickly learned to mimic successful strategies while avoiding the pitfalls that had caused other gangs to fail. They focused on efficiency, secrecy, and the ability to disappear without a trace when danger arose. Unlike other groups, they avoided unnecessary violence in public spaces, understanding that overt aggression attracted police attention. Instead, they preferred targeted intimidation and careful planning to achieve their objectives. This approach made them almost invisible in the early years, blending into communities while quietly building influence. Trust and loyalty became the backbone of their operations. Membership was often limited to blood relatives or people from the same village, creating a tightly knit network where betrayal was rare. Outsiders were seldom admitted, and those who broke the rules were punished quietly but severely. This strict internal discipline allowed the groups to operate with minimal interference, even when law enforcement agencies underestimated them. To the authorities, they seemed like minor players, scattered and harmless. In reality, they were quietly learning the intricacies of organized crime, preparing to become dominant forces in Europe's shadow economy. The Albanians also recognized the importance of adaptability. They were quick to identify gaps left by other criminal organizations. Where others relied on outdated methods, they introduced new techniques for smuggling, money laundering, and recruitment. They experimented with routes, timing, and contacts, often testing multiple strategies before settling on the most efficient approach. Their patience and methodical planning gave them an advantage that no amount of brute force could replicate. By the late 1990s, they had already begun to establish small, semi-independent cells across major European cities, each operating under the same disciplined principles, but capable of acting independently when necessary. This period of observation and learning laid the foundation for their future dominance. The Albanians were not merely copying existing criminal networks. They were studying them, identifying weaknesses, and developing systems that could outmaneuver rivals and law enforcement alike. The result was a generation of criminals who combined the ruthlessness learned in Albania with strategic intelligence gained in Europe. They understood both the streets and the bureaucracy, the risk and the reward. In this way, the Albanian gangs were no longer outsiders. They were becoming masters of the hidden world, quietly preparing to take control of Europe's dark economy with precision, discipline, and an almost invisible hand. Their rise was not explosive or chaotic. It was slow, careful, and inevitable, setting the stage for a network that would soon reach across borders and transform the criminal landscape forever. By the late 1990s, Albanian gangs had established themselves as disciplined and secretive networks in several European cities. But their real transformation came when they connected with international drug suppliers. South American cocaine cartels were producing enormous quantities of the drug, and European demand was growing faster than anyone could manage. Most traditional European crime groups relied on intermediaries, which increased costs and slowed deliveries. The Albanians, however, realized that by creating direct connections with suppliers, they could offer faster, more efficient transport while maximizing profits. This was a bold and risky move, but it marked the beginning of their dominance in Europe's drug trade. The cocaine corridor they established was a masterclass in planning and logistics. Albanians began using seemingly ordinary cargo shipments to hide drugs. Fruit containers, pallets of electronics, and even industrial equipment became vehicles for smuggling. At first, only a few kilograms were moved, but as confidence and trust grew on both sides of the transaction, the quantities increased exponentially. Ports in Italy, the Netherlands, and Belgium became central hubs for these operations. Yet most shipments passed undetected because the Albanians avoided attracting attention. Unlike other gangs, they did not rely on violence to enforce control. They relied on secrecy, timing, and carefully chosen personnel who were completely loyal. Money from the trade flowed quickly, giving the gangs unprecedented influence. They began investing in real estate, cash-based businesses, and luxury vehicles, all while maintaining a low profile. Entire neighborhoods, once ordinary and quiet, became indirectly controlled by these networks. Local shops, bars, and warehouses were often fronts for laundering cash or storing contraband. To outsiders, life went on normally, but beneath the surface, the Albanian gangs had quietly carved out vast territories of control. The sophistication of their operations made it nearly impossible for police to track them, as cash movements were carefully disguised through complex layers of legitimate businesses. Their success also attracted attention from rival criminal groups, but the Albanians were prepared. They did not confront competitors openly. Instead, they used speed, discipline, and strategic alliances to edge others out. While Italian or British gangs often relied on reputation and brute force, the Albanians relied on precision. They planned every shipment down to the hour, anticipated law enforcement patterns, and developed backup routes in case of interception. These networks were resilient, capable of operating even if a single shipment failed or a minor arrest occurred. By the early 2000s, the Albanians were no longer just participants in Europe's drug trade. They were key players shaping it. Cocaine, once controlled by long-standing European mafias, began flowing predominantly through their networks. Their rise was silent, almost invisible, and that was their greatest advantage. No headlines marked their victories. No public violence signaled their growth. The streets remained calm, even as their influence expanded across borders. The combination of intelligence, secrecy, and ruthless efficiency allowed them to dominate an entire sector of the underground economy with minimal resistance. This stage marked a turning point. From small immigrant groups struggling to survive, the Albanians had evolved into a formidable criminal force. They had learned, adapted, and finally executed a plan that allowed them to rise above rivals, turning necessity and survival into opportunity and empire. Europe's dark economy, once fragmented and controlled by familiar players, was now quietly under the influence of an organized, patient, and highly efficient network. The cocaine corridor was not just a means of profit. It was the foundation upon which the Albanian gangs would build their future dominance, stretching their reach across the continent with stealth and precision that few could challenge. In London, the Albanian gang's influence grew faster than most law enforcement agencies anticipated. The city, with its sprawling neighborhoods, busy ports, and diverse immigrant communities, provided the perfect environment for their operations. Unlike other criminal organizations that relied on flashy displays of power or territorial battles, the Albanians moved silently, embedding themselves into the city's economy and social fabric. They established safe houses in ordinary residential areas, choosing locations that drew no attention. Apartments above shops, shared houses in quiet suburbs, and rented townhouses became nerve centers for planning, storage, and distribution. To the outside observer, these were ordinary dwellings. To those involved, they were highly organized hubs coordinating multi-million-pound operations. The gang's operations in London were built on meticulous organization and discipline. Unlike impulsive street-level criminals, they relied on precision and secrecy. Cash, often in enormous quantities, moved through layers of businesses designed to look legitimate: car washes, small construction firms, import-export companies, and even nightclubs. Each transaction was carefully recorded in coded ledgers, often using multiple currencies or false invoices to obscure its origin. By the time law enforcement noticed irregularities, the money had been moved, laundered, and reinvested. These methods allowed the gangs to maintain a financial empire that operated openly in the shadows, invisible to most regulators, while simultaneously funding drug shipments, bribery, and expansion. Rival criminal groups struggled to understand the Albania's methods. While many gangs relied on intimidation, public violence, or visible displays of strength, the Albanians avoided all of it unless absolutely necessary. They were not seeking recognition or dominance in the public eye. Their power was calculated and discreet. Conflicts with other gangs were resolved in private, often through careful negotiation or subtle threats, ensuring that law enforcement remained unaware of their true reach. Their silent approach confused rivals, who could not predict their moves or understand the scope of their influence. In addition to their financial operations, the Albanians excelled at logistics. They controlled the movement of drugs with military-like precision. Couriers, often young members or trusted family associates, transported shipments across the city using multiple routes to avoid detection. Timing was everything. Deliveries were planned for hours when traffic or police presence was minimal, and backup plans were always in place in case of unexpected complications. This level of organization allowed them to operate at a scale that many older, more established European gangs could not match. Despite their growing power, the gangs maintained a low profile in public spaces. Neighborhoods remained calm, and most citizens were unaware of the empire operating around them. Their influence was subtle but pervasive. Businesses, rental properties, and even certain social circles were indirectly controlled or monitored by Albanian networks. London had become the financial heart of their operations in Europe, not through intimidation or chaos, but through strategy, discipline, and an almost invisible hand. By the mid-2000s, the Albanian presence in London had shifted from a hidden network to a quietly dominant force. They were no longer small immigrant groups seeking survival. They were organized, disciplined, and capable of controlling the city's illicit markets with precision. Their ability to move undetected, combined with loyalty among members and strategic thinking, made them a force that few could challenge. London had become the center of an invisible empire, a city where the true power was never seen, but always felt a dominance, built not on spectacle, but on controlled patience and an unmatched understanding of how to operate in the shadows. Inside the Albanian gangs, loyalty was more than a value. It was a law enforced with silent, unyielding power. Unlike many criminal organizations that relied on fear displayed through public acts of violence, these groups cultivated an environment where trust and blood ties determined survival. Every member, whether a courier, enforcer, or financial operator, was bound to the network by family, village connections, or years of shared hardship. Breaking that trust, even in the smallest way, could result in sudden disappearance, leaving behind only whispers of consequences. This strict internal discipline created an atmosphere of quiet fear, one that ensured cohesion and efficiency, while keeping law enforcement and outsiders perpetually off balance. The structure of the gangs mirrored family hierarchies more than traditional criminal organizations. Leadership positions were often inherited or assigned based on loyalty, capability, and connections rather than brute strength or charisma alone. Senior members oversaw operations across countries, coordinating drug shipments, money laundering, and recruitment. They maintained communication through coded messages, trusted intermediaries, and carefully planned travel schedules. Each cell operated semi-independently, yet remained deeply connected to the central leadership. This decentralized structure made it nearly impossible for authorities to dismantle the entire network, as taking down one cell rarely disrupted the others. Enforcement within the gangs was quiet but absolute. Disobedience or betrayal did not result in public spectacle. There were no headlines or warnings for outsiders to see. Instead, punishments were swift, private, and definitive. Members who broke the rules often vanished without explanation, sending a clear message to others without drawing attention from authorities. This method of silent discipline reinforced loyalty far more effectively than overt violence could have, creating a culture where members adhered to rules out of fear, respect, and necessity. The gangs operated in the shadows, yet the consequences for failure were immediate and inescapable. The public narrative of the Albanian gang's downfall often painted a misleading picture. Headlines screamed of arrests, raids, and the apparent collapse of a sprawling criminal network, creating the illusion that law enforcement had finally succeeded. Yet the reality was far more complex. While some leaders were captured and jailed, many others disappeared before authorities could reach them, vanishing into safe houses, foreign countries, or carefully constructed aliases. The arrests slowed operations and caused temporary disruptions, but they did not dismantle the core of the organization. The gangs had been built with resilience in mind, structured to survive losses and adapt to pressure, making their apparent fall more of a pause than an end. Even in the wake of significant arrests, new leaders quickly emerged. Younger members, trained in the discipline, secrecy, and operational intelligence of the older generation, stepped into vacated roles. These successors were often more tech-savvy, flexible, and daring, employing modern tools to manage communications, finances, and logistics. Social media, encrypted messaging, and digital banking systems provided new avenues to expand influence while remaining largely undetectable. The organization's adaptability meant that even as the world celebrated supposed victories against them, the Albanian networks quietly recalibrated, learning from mistakes and reinforcing weaknesses exposed by law enforcement campaigns. The gangs also diversified their operations to reduce risk. While drugs remained a central source of income, they increasingly branched into other sectors of the dark economy. Human trafficking, arms smuggling, counterfeit goods, and money laundering through legitimate businesses became integrated into the network. Each operation was compartmentalized, ensuring that if one sector faced disruption, the others could continue without significant impact. This diversification not only protected the organization, but also made it harder for authorities to fully assess their reach. While raids and arrests made headlines, the true scale of the empire remained hidden behind layers of complexity and deception. Despite law enforcement pressure, the networks maintained control in key regions across Europe. Safe houses, transportation routes, and financial pipelines were quickly rerouted when compromised. Communication protocols were tightened, and membership loyalty was reinforced through family ties, village connections, and shared history. The network's culture of trust, fear, and discipline ensured that even under intense scrutiny, information leaks remained rare. The organization's survival was a testament to the foresight of its founders, who had built a system designed not merely to thrive in calm conditions, but to endure crises and emerge stronger. The media, meanwhile, often misinterpreted the story. Sensational headlines focused on arrests or isolated disruptions, giving the impression that the gangs were in retreat. Yet these reports failed to capture the strategic adjustments occurring behind the scenes. What appeared to be a downfall was in reality a calculated evolution. The Albanian networks were not tied to individual leaders. They were systems of power capable of self-regeneration. Their ability to replace lost members, reroute operations, and adapt to new circumstances allowed them to maintain influence and continue expanding quietly, even as public perception suggested otherwise. By the end of this period, it became clear that the Albanian gangs had survived what could have been a catastrophic blow. Their empire had been tested, but the network's structure, discipline, and adaptability allowed it to endure. While some may have viewed the arrests as victory, the organization had already demonstrated that it could operate under pressure, evolve with new technologies, and prepare the next generation to take control. The fall was not a collapse, it was a lesson in resilience. And Europe's dark economy remained very much under the influence of a hidden, evolving, and silent force that few fully understood. Today, The influence of Albanian gangs continues to ripple across Europe's dark economy, a silent force that shapes illicit markets without ever appearing in the spotlight. Their story is not one of sudden, chaotic domination, but of patient, calculated growth that began in the chaos of post-communist Albania and expanded quietly across borders. Even after arrests, raids, and international crackdowns, the organization endures, demonstrating that its power lies not in individual leaders or flashy operations, but in the system itself. Families, villages, and loyal networks form the backbone of a criminal machine designed to survive challenges and adapt to change. Their empire is resilient because it is built to be invisible, efficient, and disciplined. In cities across Europe, from London to Milan and from Brussels to Amsterdam, Albanian gangs maintain influence in drug trafficking, human smuggling, and other forms of organized crime. Safe houses, shell companies, and semi-legitimate businesses continue to funnel resources, hide profits, and facilitate operations. To ordinary citizens, life goes on normally. The streets remain calm, the neighborhoods quiet. Yet beneath this surface, a network of rules, loyalty, and strategic planning governs enormous flows of money and goods. Their operations are meticulously planned, minimizing risk while maximizing profit, allowing them to remain a dominant force without drawing attention. The adaptability of these gangs has been central to their continued dominance. When law enforcement closes one route, they find another. When a shipment is seized, backup operations ensure that the market never collapses. Young members, raised in the culture of loyalty and discipline, step into leadership roles, often bringing with them new skills in technology, finance, and logistics. These generations inherit not just wealth, but a playbook for survival and expansion, ensuring that the empire continues even when older leaders are arrested or disappear. The network is not dependent on any single individual. It functions as a self-sustaining system, able to evolve in response to external threats. The story of Albanian gangs is also a story of societal vulnerability. Their rise demonstrates how poverty, political instability, and weak borders can create conditions for organized crime to flourish. From the desperate streets of post-1990s Albania to the thriving metropolises of Western Europe, these gangs exploited gaps in law enforcement, capitalized on economic inequality, and used family loyalty to maintain cohesion. Their operations illustrate that crime is not always loud or chaotic. Often, it is quiet, methodical, and strategically hidden, making it far more dangerous and difficult to eradicate. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of their influence is its invisibility. Unlike traditional criminal organizations, the Albanian gangs rarely seek public attention. There are no dramatic shootouts in the streets, no banners marking territory, no high-profile gang wars. Their power is exercised quietly, through control of financial flows, careful management of logistics, and unwavering internal discipline. The empire exists in plain sight, yet few outside the organization truly grasp its reach. In the end, the story of Albanian gangs is not just a tale of crime. It is a study of resilience, adaptability, and the quiet accumulation of power. Their rise serves as a warning. When opportunity meets strategy and secrecy, even the most unexpected groups can dominate complex systems. Europe's dark economy remains deeply shaped by these networks, a reminder that real power is not always visible, and that the lessons of the past continue to resonate in the shadows of the present. Their influence lingers, not through noise or spectacle, but through the silent, enduring mechanisms of control that they have perfected over decades.